Your take on the situation? I mean, it's looking pretty bad for the Conservatives. What do you think?
Yeah, they're clearly very bad results for the Conservative Party. I don't think they will have come as a surprise to anyone in Downing Street. They're consistent with the state of the opinion polls at the moment. I think just two very small rays of hope they will have. One is I think the evidence is pretty clear that the problem is not Rishi Sunak. If you look at the polling at the moment, as I said, the Conservatives are well behind. But if you ask people who they prefer as Prime Minister between Starmer and Sunak, he's neck and neck on that measure. So I think that tells you that the problem the Conservatives have is the damage that his two predecessors, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, did to the Conservative brand. And he's got an incredibly difficult job trying to recover from that.
Just before you move on from that, Nadine Dorris has been tweeting. You will have seen her tweet. She says that, you worked for Theresa May, and Theresa May's removal came following a disastrous general election, which lost almost, huge numbers of Conservative MPs. I mean, what do you say to her? I mean, she's probably, the subtext is she's probably saying to you, you've got no right to criticise us in terms of people that were connected to Boris Johnson because you had a bad set of results as well when you worked for Theresa May. What would you say back to her?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen her tweets. If she's trying to personalise it about me, I didn't have anything to do with the 2017 election campaign. But in terms of the result there, it's certainly true. It was a very disappointing campaign in terms of seats won, although it's worth observing that Theresa added 2.3 million votes compared with what David Cameron got in 2015. So the problem was more that Labour also did very well. Actually, the Conservative vote went up very significantly and was very similar to what Boris Johnson achieved in 2019. But whatever you think of Theresa May, that doesn't change the verdict on Boris Johnson. And, Nadine may prefer to make it about other people, but the facts are that Johnson and particularly Liz Truss did profound damage to the Conservative Party's standing, and no one can deny that. You only have to look at the running average of the opinion polls to see very clearly what happened, and Rishi Sunak has inherited that mess and is trying to repair it. Now, the other point that I was going to make in terms of a kind of ray of light is that I think if you look at the results for Labour, they're good. There's no denying that. But they're not, I think, suggesting Labour are on course for an outright victory at the next election. So the last thing I saw from a Labour spokesman was saying they think they'll be about 8 percentage points ahead in what's called the national equivalent vote share. And that's better than anything they've achieved since 2010. But it's only a bit better than Ed Miliband achieved in 2012. It's nothing like as strong a victory as the ones Tony Blair was achieving in the mid-1990s. So I hope that the people in Downing Street look at this and think, well, there's no disguising their very bad results. But they suggest that if Sunak can continue the progress that he's been making since he took over, it's not a done deal that Labour are going to win the next election yet. Okay. They're still in with a shout. It's incredibly difficult for them from the position that they inherited, but there are little glimmers of hope there. I wouldn't put it any stronger than that.
And also you make that really important point, and we have been stressing it, that Labour really does have a mountain to climb. I've used this fact a lot, but I think it's very powerful. Even if Keir Starmer gets the same swing as Tony Blair did in 1997, he only gets a working majority of one. So that gives you a bit of context. Just some breaking news in. Labour now controls Swindon Council. That is an area that they've really been piling a lot of resources in on that. So there we go. Now listen, Gavin, the other thing I really wanted to ask you was, so you've got some glimmers of hope for Rishi Sunak. What do you think he does next? Because, of course, the noises off will start from whether it's the sort of Nadine Dorris side of the Conservative Party that want to sort of, agitate for a Boris Johnson comeback. There will be others, from the ERG and others who will be very annoyed about what's happening. What should Rishi Sunak do? Does he try and tack more to the centre of British politics, or does he continue going down, a more Suella Braverman, Lee Anderson type of narrative? What would you advise him to do?
So I actually think the broad strategy he set out is about right. If you think about the 5 issues that he identified that he wanted to make progress on this year in terms of getting inflation down, people have really struggled with the rising cost of living over the last couple of years, getting the economy growing more strongly, to getting on top of the debt problem, crucially making some progress on the NHS, and also dealing with the small boats issue, which is a big issue for at least parts of the electorate, many of them Conservative supporters. That feels like the right kind of mix of issues. The problem he's got, Aisha, is that the Conservative Party, in my experience, basically has two settings: complacency or panic. And it kind of flips between those two. And actually, it needs to be somewhere in between this time. It needs to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation that it finds itself in, which is entirely of its own making. And it needs to avoid panic and get behind the Prime Minister and try and support him as he tries to dig it out of the terrible hole that his two predecessors left him in.
I mean, you make that point about the party not panicking and coming together, but we all know how febrile politics can be and how a party which is doing badly, funnily enough, that its first instinct is to sort of turn in on itself and start fighting. I mean, that definitely has happened with the Labour Party. I've had much experience of that. You've had experience of that with Theresa May. Danny Finkelstein writes a great piece today in The Times. He says, look, all of these ousted councillors are going to be annoyed. They're going to be furious. They've lost their passion. They've lost their livelihoods, and they could cause a problem for Rishi Sunak. How does he handle that sort of emotional fallout? Because when you lose great numbers of seats like this, there's a lot of emotion in politics. There's a lot of rage as well.
Yeah, so the first thing he needs to do is acknowledge it's not their fault and sympathise with them and show some empathy. I think actually if you listen, I mean, I've heard a number of council leaders who've lost overnight interviewed today. And actually, a number of them have acknowledged that it's not Rishi Sunak's fault. You know, they're very clear that it's the kind of national environment, what's gone on before him, the economic challenges that we have at the moment. So I think as long as he takes responsibility, as it were, on behalf of the National Party and shows some empathy for what they've been through, that will stand him in good stead with those activists. And he's got to set out a plan for how the Conservative Party can rebuild from the position that it finds itself in. But there is, I think, quite a bit of sympathy in the party for the situation that he's inherited and the scale of the challenge that is before him. And you know, and you say you often get panic in political parties. That's absolutely true. You also know that nearly always the panic just makes things worse, not better.